These viruses exist in nature, whether we admit it or not. If we don't study them, there may be another outbreak and we won't be ready. The unknown viruses that we discovered are just the tip of the iceberg. We conducted experiments in our laboratory to see if these viruses can jump to humans to create a pandemic.
From Microbe TV, episode 582, recorded on January 2nd, 2020. I'm Dissent and Drastic, and today we have a story coming out of Wuhan, China.
We're going to begin here with the outbreak of a mystery virus in China that now has the World Health Organization on
The World Health Organization says is likely to be from the same family that produced the deadly SARS outbreak.
Sounds like SARS-1, doesn't it, back in 2003? And there have been accusations that this virus came from a laboratory.
If you go online, there's no shortage of conspiracy theories.
Deliberately made in a laboratory or accidentally released.
I think they made a horrible mistake, and they didn't want to admit it.
And the real question is, of course, where did it come from? Virology is really nuanced. What makes me angry is people talking about areas that they don't know about. I've spent 40 years studying viruses, which is not meant to be arrogant. It's just meant that if you don't know the field well, you should stay in your lane.
We now need to appeal to every single American so that they can have their role in stopping the spread of this virus.
Protect each other to ensure that the virus doesn't spread.
I'm Deborah Birx. I was the COVID response coordinator out of the White House. I think for those of us who worked in Asia when the SARS hit, it was clear that China knew there was a problem and told people very late. So I was very worried that they were being less than transparent during the early days of this surge. They panicked, the government and the government workers, when they saw how far out of control this was. The most important thing were the videos that were posted of the hospitals. You could just see the horror. You could see people walking down hospital with body bags all along the corridor. It was in that moment that you know that we're in for a devastating global pandemic.
I've been through the mill on China. I've been through the engagement. I've been through the estrangement. But what I have observed was the single biggest up in the history of Communist China. In the spring of 2020, up at the State Department, my job was to investigate the origins of COVID-19 All these alarm bells are ringing. People are telling me there's this super virus. They think it's SARS on steroids is how I think it was described. And the Chinese government is destroying evidence and telling that anyone who communicates about it is going to be potentially imprisoned or worse. If they didn't know the origin of whatever this thing was, natural or supernatural, they would never destroy evidence.
The issue of where COVID came from is a reflection more of transparency of China. Because if China had been transparent all along, we could have been able to pinpoint what happened.
State Department guys like me who are paid to be skeptical and, look to try to get to the bottom of conspiracies, not conspiracy theories, conspiracies, real conspiracies. This behavior that was totally malicious in orientation, there was a massive cover-up. That is not consistent with something that is of natural origin, in my experience.
Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton has been calling out China for its response to this outbreak, suggesting the virus may have come from China's biological warfare program.
A slew of COVID-19 misinformation has been going viral on social media.
As hard as authorities are working to provide accurate, up-to-date information, they are working just as hard to correct misinformation, unfounded hysteria and alarm.
In every pandemic, this happens. With the HIV/AIDS, and there were posters saying that it was made in a government lab. I think many people who don't understand science, they need to know how things happen, and if they read or hear something that seems plausible, they'll accept it.
It's very harmful, it's very dangerous to stir up suspicion, rumors, and spread them among the people.
Where did the virus come from?
Probably coming from some animals.
I could talk forever about viruses. I love viruses more than anything else on the planet, including my family. When you think about origins of viruses, one of the things that has to guide you is history. And so far, with one exception, every pandemic virus came from an animal to begin with. The movie Contagion tried to give you a sequence of events that led to the spillover of that virus. We use the word spillover to describe when a virus that infects a non-human animal, a rodent, a bat, a cow, then infects people. That was a different series of events than we've known for any other virus so far. How many different ways can a virus get from animals into people? For MERS coronaviruses in the Middle East, we found that camels were the source of those little outbreaks. For HIV, this is the best story, in my opinion. After many years, we found that chimpanzees were the source of HIV in the 1920s. And that got rid of all the conspiracy theories. Until we get the animal with the virus that made its way into people. There will always be some doubters, but the vast majority of virologists understand that SARS-CoV-2 had a natural origin.
The world is extremely complicated and disrupted right now, as I think we all know.
I'm Jeffrey Sachs. I'm a university professor at Columbia University. I'm an economist, but I had worked in public health issues actually for many, many years and had chaired a commission on public health for the World Health Organization. 2020 was already in an era of huge distrust. America was divided in almost civil war during the Trump period. The president himself, Trump, constantly saying fake news, fake news. You add this pandemic to distrust, to high political polarization, to social media. It's quite a brew.
They're afraid of the letter Q, you know. The real
When you face a pandemic, you try to identify people who know something. There's a group of virologists. You turn to them. It's important to hear what those who study such issues for a living say about it. There was a letter written to the Lancet, an influential scientific publication. We are public health scientists who have closely followed the emergence of 2019 novel coronavirus disease, or COVID-19. The rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. We speak in one voice. We declare no competing interests. This seemed like a pretty straightforward call. Stick to the science.
Finding the origin of a virus is very much like a detective story. As soon as maps were available where dots indicated an infection, I began to track it on a day-to-day basis. The earliest cases occurred in the vicinity or within the Wuhan seafood market.
Chinese authorities have traced a new strain of coronavirus back to this seafood market in the city of Wuhan.
So now we have the murder scene. And then we would like to know where it came from, who committed the murder, and to do that, we need to look in the market. Inside the market, there are wild animals in cages, and the cages are stacked upon each other so that, you know, the animals on the top, when they urinate and defecate, it will all drip down onto the other animals and infect them all. So it's not a great situation. And then you're bringing a lot of people in. Animals are brought in, you buy them, and they're slaughtered, and you bring them home and you eat them. So it's a perfect place to have a spillover. The best hypothesis is that the virus originated in a bat, and that bat infected an animal which was then brought into the Wuhan seafood market, where it then infected humans.
In March 2020, a paper came out by a number of well-known virologists on a major scientific journal, Nature Medicine, called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, of the virus. And it was that proximal origins paper, more than the letter to the Lancet, which basically said, it's overwhelmingly likely that this is a natural spillover. We are destabilizing Mother Nature, and we pay a consequence for that provocation. Just like SARS, here we go again.
Dr. Fauci, could you address these suggestions or concerns that this virus was somehow man-made, possibly came out of a laboratory?
A group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve, and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Everything was moving very fast, and science seemed to be working very well, which is that within a short period of time, the new pathogen was identified, it was sequenced. Things seemed to be on accelerated hyperspeed of understanding.
The Wuhan lab, we know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified or anything like that.
This was all basically within 3 months of a new disease. So no one had any strong cause to doubt this scientific prowess and these insights early on. They seemed rather convincing.
Reading Proximal Origin actually had the opposite effect on me. It brought out the side of me that wanted to challenge these assertions. The arguments put forth were almost pseudoscientific. I was born in Canada, and I grew up in Singapore. Singapore placed a lot of importance on grades, but I wouldn't say that I was the type who studied all day. And in fact, I actually played truant quite a bit. I got really close to the point of expulsion from high school, and one of my teachers realized I was just going off the rails, and I needed to be brought back into something that would hold my focus, and that turned out to be mathematics. I just love solving puzzles. In the beginning, I was just motivated by curiosity. At the time, I was really interested in finding out how exactly the virus was infecting human cells. But once we had the genome of the virus, most people will pay attention to the spike. This is a protein that's sticking out of the virus, and it is the part that recognizes cells that it can infect. One really curious thing was this unique feature called a furin cleavage site. Without the furin cleavage sites, it's much more difficult for the pandemic virus to infect different cells in your body. This struck me as really odd, because SARS-1 does not have a furin cleavage site, and no SARS virus known to date in the wild, except for the pandemic virus, has a furin cleavage site.
That became the focus. That's a key to the whole story. Where did that come from?
The Proximal Origin letter actually says that the pandemic virus was well adapted to cause a human pandemic from the get-go. But they said that this could have only happened naturally.
Is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
When you look at viruses, especially coming from bats, they tend to need to evolve to try a lot of different combinations of mutations in order to find the answer, the ability to cause pandemics in human, a new host. In this case, we've seen a virus, a well-adapted virus, just suddenly appear in Wuhan with no trace of that adaptation process. We have not found an infected reservoir of animals. We haven't found how it reached Wuhan. Then my question was it unfortunately adapted in a lab? And it could have led to a lab release. The scientists in Wuhan put out 2 papers on the coronavirus. They went into great detail on the virus and its sequence, but they did not mention the furin cleavage site. These scientists had left out such a key piece of information. It's like saying that a unicorn is rampaging in their city and is sighted at the market, and when they write their first paper describing this creature, they don't mention the horn. They talk about everything else, the hair, the hooves, the color of the horse, but they don't mention the horn.
Just because you found a horse with a horn on its head doesn't mean that it's a unicorn. Many viruses have furin cleavage sites naturally, and quite frankly, it doesn't show any signs of engineering. It shows signs of being a randomly inserted FCS from nature. I'm Angela Rasmussen. I'm a virologist. I'm originally from the US, but currently I live in beautiful Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan. It's pretty cliched, actually, for a virologist. I read The Hot Zone when I was in school. It was shocking to me that a virus could emerge really anywhere in the world at any time and potentially kill a lot of people horribly. So I decided to pursue emerging viruses. I certainly think that we're in an age of disinformation. We're seeing a lot of people distributing inaccurate information about all manner of things. And I think that people don't know what's true.
Bill and Melinda Gates funding a group to create it. It's obviously been souped up and is weaponized.
I first got involved with this discussion to actually tweet to people since there was so much interest in the topic, basically what was and what wasn't. Alina Chan is a former postdoctoral fellow and molecular biologist at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Her contributions early on in the pandemic were to start essentially doing detective work out of her home on what the origins could be, and she's made it into sort of a second little career for herself.
I guess in an ideal world, finding the origin of a novel virus would be conducted entirely by experts, solving it objectively together. But many experts rushed in to close the door on a lab origin.
Social media platforms have also taken steps to limit the spread of misinformation.
The first people to really descend on me were other scientists saying that I was just riding a wave of conspiracy to get attention. People arguing about my qualifications. I did feel very alone. Other scientists were not coming out publicly because of fears of retaliation. This left it to a hodgepodge group of people around the world to do their own investigations and formed this group called Drastic.
Drastic is a very loose and autonomous collective of people on the internet initially that just came together around this question of COVID origins, leaning towards a possible lab leak origin of coronavirus. I actually looked into the genome when I started investigating for myself. The first thing that jumps out is this furin cleavage site. The deeper I looked into it, the more questions I had about why did mainstream scientists dismiss so early the possibility that this could have been a lab leak. Not necessarily a nefarious lab leak, not a bioweapon, but just a lab accident of people, virologists, working on these viruses.
They haven't come up with a rational scientific argument. They've come up with shortcuts and easy pictures that you can actually print in the press to shape the opinion. Science is about people. It's about scientists. It's about outsiders sometimes. And because there was such a repression of any dissenting voices, it was most likely that the dissidents would be coming from the margins. Every young scientist, except for Alina Chan, was just being very careful, because it was basically the equivalent of committing scientific or career suicide. They say it's quite possible that it came from a lab.
After the Proxima origin paper came out, the Lancet letter, there was a campaign to paint the lab leak hypothesis as something only crazy conspiracists could believe in, even though we still didn't find any plausible intermediate host or basically haven't learned any novel evidence of a natural spillover of this virus. Any evidence that they can point to at the Hunan seafood market, initially that they pointed to, is just, I think, completely unconvincing.
When the Chinese CDC told the world in January 2020 that the virus had come from illegally sold animals at the market, there was a huge rush to find this intermediate host, this mystery animal. When they arrived on the scene, they also started disinfecting. They had hired people to come and clean up the whole place so that it would no longer be a public health risk. They took animal samples. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of live animals left. It's actually unclear how many live animals were left in that market that could have potentially been intermediate hosts. They also took environmental samples. So these are swabs from like the washroom, from the sewerage, from tables, doorknobs, cages, that kind of thing. And they brought all these back to the labs for testing. And what they found was that none of the samples they had taken from animal carcasses or the stray cats on the market tested positive for virus. So it's no sign of an infected animal there. But they did find that there were a lot of environmental samples across this massive market. So it was clear that it was people spreading this virus. Clearly, the market was ground zero, but we don't know who or what brought the virus into the market. I think everyone acknowledges that an ancestor of the pandemic virus must have existed in bats in South China or Southeast Asia at some point. The question is, how did it get up from there into Wuhan city? Was it through animals, which are known to carry these viruses? Or was it through the scientists, who were known to be sampling exactly these viruses from South China, from bats, from wildlife, and even sick people, and bringing them up into Wuhan city?
My name is Linfa Wang. I'm a virologist and specialize in emerging infectious diseases, and especially the viruses that are coming out of bats. My life is full of accidental, encounters, or you can call it a destiny. I came up with this kind of, people think it's a crazy idea. I came up with the hypothesis that the SARS-CoV-1 could jump out of bats. Very few scientists warm up to my idea. And then the director of Wuhan Institute of Virology to say, we have that Professor Shi in our institute. She is interested in epidemiology and virus hunting. She might be the only one maybe interested. The first time I traveled to Wuhan was 2004 and met Professor Shi. This is a kind of, love at first sight in science, basically. When we first met, we just like each other, the ideas, the personality all fits. And so we start to collaborate.
大家好，我来自中国科学院武汉病毒研究所，我叫史正丽。今天非常高兴在一席的讲台上为大家讲述。
1 year later, we discovered the origin of SARS-1 in bats.
After the expeditions to find the bat reservoir of the 2003 SARS virus, there started to be this huge momentum building up globally, but mostly initiated in the US, to go out into the world, into hotspots where viruses emerge, and to collect as many viruses as possible to figure out what's out there and what might cause outbreaks. The scientists who were for this project just wanted to build a massive global database, a global virome project, where you have all of these viruses and start developing therapeutics for them. These collaborations were multi-million-dollar collaborations spanning multiple countries. And one of these key collaborations was between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the EcoHealth Alliance based in New York.
My organization, EcoHealth Alliance, believes we can stop these pandemics. And it's not just HIV/AIDS. Let's look at them. SARS, Ebola, Lyme disease, West Nile. The common thread is wildlife. These pathogens emerge from wildlife.
Peter Daszak, we met each other before even SARS-CoV-1. So I met Peter first before I met Professor Shi Zhenli.
What worries me the most is that we're going to miss the next emerging disease, that we're going to suddenly find a SARS virus that moves from one part of the planet to another, wiping out people as it moves along.
But I'm not a bat biologist. I don't go to caves and sample bats myself. They do that.
Dr. Shi Zhenli had become known as the Bat Woman. She was the most prominent SARS hunter in China.
采蝙蝠这个科研工作。那么有的时候呢，蝙蝠里边的洞很大，但是洞口非常小，所以我们要爬着进去，包括我们的体型。看我这么瘦啊，是有要求的，要不然就爬不进去。
Peter Daszak has been publicly telling everyone about how close they are, that he would go to their karaoke parties. They became longtime partners and friends. They were obviously very close and very proud of their collaboration. Like Peter Daszak was at many public meetings boasting about the dozens and hundreds of new SARS-like viruses they had found. Over the next 2 decades, they would go to dozens of these caves, especially in South China and Southeast Asia. They would set up traps for the bats. And once they caught the bats, they would take swabs from different parts of the body. And they would take these virus samples back into the lab to figure out which ones could jump from wild animals into people. The Wuhan Institute of Virology had a public database, and it described some 22,000 samples taken from bats and other wildlife from China and other places.
The funny thing is that that database is exactly the kind of tool you would want to use when you have an epidemic like this. Okay, I mean, you should say, God, thanks, we've got the database. Yeah, what happened to the database? Well, 3 years down the road, nobody has opened it.
This database had been accessed hundreds of times by people even outside of China, but it was taken off public access in September 2019. And when the outbreak happened, it was not reinstated. So the question is, did the Wuhan Institute of Virology have SARS-CoV-2 or a close relative in their collection?
I mean, the first thing you want is to have access to the bloody thing, okay? But the first thing that happens is that access is removed.
Later on, when Xi Jianling was asked about the database, she said they took it offline because of some hacking attempts. Maybe they themselves were afraid of people finding something in there that could have strengthened the case for a lab leak.
Look, I don't really want to speculate about that, but the reality is that we know nearly nothing about whatever was actually collected by the WIV and Chinese teams from 2017 on. So if you want to clear things out, you open the database, show what's there.
These virus hunters, they were really seen as heroes. So to find themselves in this position where they might actually be responsible for the worst pandemic most of us have ever known, it's unthinkable for them that suddenly they're no longer the heroes, but maybe the culprits.
That's total. This is an example of one of these what-if bits of evidence. The pandemic didn't start until November or December 2019, so I don't think it was a coincidence or even related at all that the database became inaccessible in September, 2 months before the virus emerged into the human population. What if this database contained the sequence to the secret progenitor of SARS coronavirus 2? Okay, what if? But do you have any evidence of that? I don't think anybody does.
而且所有美国对我们的一些攻击，这个首先它攻击的这个内容就不存在。我们实验室从来就没有这个新冠病毒，原来没有操作，在2019年12月30号之前，我们没有这样的一个病毒的存在，所以不存在实验室的泄露。
Her lab, without any doubt, has the largest collection of these bat coronavirus samples. She was the first one to really think this is a laboratory contamination. She went through all the sequence that she already have in her collection and said nothing related to SARS-CoV-2. So they said the chance of my lab, leaked anything or contaminate anything is zero.
The idea that this virus escaped from the lab is just pure baloney. It's simply not true. I've been working with that lab for 15 years. We do basically know what's in those databases. There is no evidence of viruses closer to SARS-CoV-2 in those databases.
I don't see any reason not to give my Chinese colleagues the same benefit of the doubt that I would give to anybody else. I don't see any reason to doubt her just because she's living in China and nobody from China can be trusted either because they are lying or because the government is making them do so.
I think in the spirit of scientific progress and also international harmony, it's really important that scientists around the world can work freely with each other. But I think reality is not that simple. And what the funders and organizers soon realized was that despite having all these collaborations, each collaborator could decide what data to share. And they only discovered this many millions of dollars later. Unfortunately, that's what happened when the novel coronavirus outbreak happened. Immediately, the scientists in Wuhan could decide what to share or not to share. They were not the first to share the genome of the virus. They were not the first to tell us of the human-to-human transmission. They said nothing to see and hear.
Pretty much the entirety of the case against the research-related origin hypothesis rests upon the unverified word of Shi Zhengli. And Shi Zhengli may be a wonderful person, but she's a wonderful person working in an authoritarian context. So if Shi Zhengli was not telling the truth, that means we can't count on her word of honor about what viruses were being held, and that fundamentally changes everything. I'm Jamie Metzel. I'm founder and chair of One Shared World. I've served on the U.S. National Security Council. As a result of my collaboration with the WHO as a member of their expert advisory committee on human genome editing, I had a relationship with Dr. Tedros.
Take the number of deaths alone, more than 4 million. I think we owe it to them to know what happened. And everybody should cooperate to know what happened and to prevent the same crisis from happening again.
The Chinese government has been engaged in a massive cover-up since day one, involving destroying samples, hiding records, and actively blocking any meaningful international investigation.
China has not allowed the WHO or any other external experts to join its investigation into the origins of the pandemic.
The WHO was our only hope of getting into those labs to find the crucial evidence that could help solve this puzzle. It was only till actually January or February 2021, more than a year after the outbreak had started, that the World Health Organization was allowed to let a team of experts in to look for the origin of COVID-19.
I sent this note to Tedros. Tedros, my friend, keep up the great work. I was delighted to see the WHO tweet about the COVID-19 investigation exploring all hypotheses. That is essential. If China is willing to be a full partner and provide access to it, finally, we will get those answers.
I'm on my way for a WHO mission to China to try and see what we can learn about what really is the origin of SARS coronavirus 2. I'm Marion Koopmans. Currently, I'm head of the Erasmus Medical Center Department of Virology. Viroscience is what we call it, where I lead a big team that really studies viruses as they are affecting us.
A team of experts from the WHO on the ground in Wuhan this hour looking for clues as to where exactly the virus came from.
What we did is we said we want to discuss everything and anything that may be relevant. Relevant was also the ongoing discussion about could a lab have been involved. So on our list of places to visit and people to talk to were all the labs that had been involved in research.
A caravan of vehicles pulling into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. On board, international experts representing the World Health Organization. Their mission? To find the origin of COVID-19.
But when I saw who had been selected for the International Joint Study Group, it was just outrageous.
We're looking forward to meeting with all the key people here and asking all the important questions that need to be asked.
When it came out that Peter Daszak was an expert on this World Health Organization team, there was shock.
I'm on the WHO team for a reason, and if you're going to work in China on coronaviruses and try and understand their origins, you should involve the people who know the most about that. And for better or for worse, I do.
There was dismay amongst a lot of people, even people who were natural origin proponents said that this man has a conflict of interest, like he can't be the one. But he was the only American allowed to go on this mission.
Members of the scientific community have said that Daszak has a conflict of interest due to his close ties to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its leading scientist, Shijeng Li.
He was a serious part of the team. He had a lot of ideas and thoughts helping shape the research agenda. Maybe it was not wise, but I thought he was a welcome member of the team because of his expertise. He's been studying, certainly bat-human interactions forever.
When they went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they were shown the top biosafety level labs where it seemed really difficult for a virus to leak from, instead of the lower biosafety level labs where most of the SARS-like virus work had been done. Everyone they talked to was pre-selected for them. None of them asked for the database.
When we met with Dr. Shi, we asked also about what her take on this was, what she thought of the accusations. I felt we had a pretty frank discussion. They also, so she had some colleagues that really almost plead with us, you know, help us because they're killing her the way the discussions are going. She said that they were getting increasing attempts at hacking, and the database was not secure enough, so they took it offline to build a better one. I don't know, but to me that sounded quite credible.
Excellent facilities, very informative.
It just felt, this is a train wreck. This international team didn't even have complete control over their own itinerary. One of their first stops is essentially at a propaganda exhibition praising Xi Jinping for his effective and heroic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was a very clear statement by the Chinese, is we are going to absolutely control your agenda.
The WHO and China, the Chinese government, say the lab theory is unlikely.
The virus likely came from animals, not a lab in China.
But what is that animal? It remains, quote, elusive.
Did we get pressure from China against the lab leak? Well, yes. It was not something that they felt was a prominent hypothesis. The only thing we can do is stick to what the observations that we have, the types of studies that you would need to rule in or rule out. I don't like to attack any theory. I think this is about possible versus plausible. Do lab leaks happen? Yes. But is there any evidence of it other than there's a lab that worked on coronavirus? I don't think so.
For an accidental leak that then led to COVID to happen, the virus that causes COVID would need to be in the lab. They never had any evidence of a virus like COVID in the lab.
I don't think that you can take a lab leak seriously given the difference in the two evidence bases. Strongest evidence isn't any one piece of evidence for natural origin. It's the collection of multiple pieces and multiple threads of evidence. We have a lot of evidence, hard evidence, verifiable evidence for a natural origin. We have zero evidence for a lab leak.
Hi, this is Emily Kopp with US Right to Know, just calling to follow up on a Freedom of Information request I submitted. If you could give me a call back at your earliest convenience, I'd really appreciate it. I'd like to get these documents as soon as possible. My number is 770-789. I think this is a story about a really effective PR campaign by a small group of virologists who would like to do anything to divert the public's attention away from the possibility that virology could be responsible for a man-made disaster. My job is to compel federal agencies and universities that would prefer to operate without any transparency, oversight, and bring those documents that belong to the public into the public record. Peter Daszak, who has a lot of connections in the media, was assuring the public that there was no way research conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology could have anything to do with the outbreak of the pandemic.
I've worked for 15 years with the very lab that it was supposed to have leaked from, and it just did not pan out.
But we were curious whether he knew more than he was telling us.
My name is Paul Thacker. I'm a freelance investigative journalist. And shortly after the pandemic began, I think it was all very confusing. I don't think anyone really knew what was going on. At this point, I started reading more. And just like start putting things into a timeline. Who are all these characters involved? And you start just kind of writing that down and who everyone is. And what you begin to realize that there's a ton of money going into this type of virus research. And it's been going on for a long time. It goes back to what happened after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks in the United States. So we're going back 20 years ago, 2 decades ago.
Another day of germ warfare and still no sign the worst case of bioterrorism in this country is close to being solved.
There's no question that anybody who would mail anthrax with the attempt to harm American citizens is a terrorist.
There was a movement within the United States federal government to begin to do biodefense research, to begin to fund a lot of these labs, collecting viruses that might be dangerous, studying how they transmit.
The increase in the NIH budget is the largest single increase in the history of the NIH.
Guess who's at the center of a lot of this stuff, like catching all this money as it starts to drop down? Anthony Fauci.
Both Dr. Fauci and I came in at the end of the Carter administration or the beginning of the Reagan administration. He came in with a very specific purpose and understanding to make lives better. And that's our mission, is to translate dollars into action that change the clinical course of severe disease.
We now not only have hope and hypothesis, but that we have a real prevention and indeed a real cure. Thank you.
We have been worried about viruses and bacteria being used as weapons of war. Many of us grew up with that and working on countermeasures. I came out of the military, NIH certainly was focused on that also, and so was Dr. Fauci.
I can totally understand why Fauci would be seduced by this idea that you can prevent pandemics from ever happening again. So the National Institutes of Health was a big supporter of EcoHealth Alliance and underwrote EcoHealth Alliance's work.
And then we start to figure out that there was money going from the National Institutes of Health to Wuhan through EcoHealth Alliance.
It became apparent that if we wanted more information about what was going on in Wuhan, we needed to take a closer look at NIH. Obviously, we can't travel to Wuhan or see the lab ourselves, but we have this, powerful tool to uncover information via their partners in the U.S. So we submitted Freedom of Information Act requests related to this virus hunting. Hi, this is Emily Kopp calling with U.S. Right to Know in Washington. A few weeks later, the documents responsive to the Freedom of Information Act request came in, and most of the key information has been blacked out, has been redacted. So then you have to appeal and, badger about your appeal, at which point you may or may not get the information you're looking for. And in a lot of cases, we've, just hit a brick wall over and over again, but keep trying. Then one day, the email lands, and there's this moment of hope that there could be important puzzle pieces to this global mystery. The Lancet letter was a statement in a prestigious medical journal signed by 27 scientists condemning what they viewed as xenophobic conspiracy theories around the origins of the pandemic. It was successful in convincing a lot of people in the media not to take a closer look at the Wuhan lab. And through FOIA, we discovered that that letter had been organized by the American scientist with the biggest conflict of interest, Peter Daszak.
This is like one of the many moments I've had where I've had to go back like, wait, did they do that? And then you go back and you're spending like 2 hours like running down stuff and you're like, oh, you did that.
Scientists who organized 27 of his colleagues to sign a letter dismissing the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis as a conspiracy.
Peter Daszak is kind of a guy who's very good at knowing how to get money. A lot of people think that the smartest people at the universities are the ones who are like, well, you're the smartest scientist. That's part of it. Like, a big part of it is also like, are you able to get the grant money to support a lab? This guy's very good at getting money. Well, guess what happens when you start passing around money to a lot of people? You know what that does? That brings in a lot of goodwill. The rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation. We speak in one voice. We declare no competing interests. I mean, it's like look at it. I mean, at the time it made sense, but now it's so funny in retrospect because there's so much lies in all of this. This is what they first came out with in March of 2020. The Lancet had a commission to study the origins of COVID, like where it came from. That commission was shut down because of competing interests.
I chaired the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. I went to Daszak and I said, you're chairing a task force. I'm the chairman of the task force. I need to see the reports. He said, my lawyers say I can't give it to you. I said, are you kidding? We're a transparent international task force. If your lawyers say you can't give it to me, that's one thing, but then you can't be chair of this task force. This is completely unacceptable.
Peter Daszak, the British-born zoologist who runs EcoHealth Alliance, has revised his competing interest statement published in the respected science journal, The Lancet.
The way they put that letter together, Lancet, there's something more than just maybe it came from a lab, maybe it didn't. There's some kind of cover-up going on. And I think that's the thing, is that people want to get into these weird debates about science and everything. This is not a science debate. This is about a cover-up.
In the fall of 2020, I had the idea that we needed to roll back the tape. We made a request to the appropriate people, I'm not going to say which agencies, but trust me, it was extremely sensitive information. First and foremost, there was a military classified program going on from at least 2017, maybe earlier, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology involving dangerous pathogenic viruses. Fact two, in the fall of 2019, there were workers in the lab being hospitalized. And my impression is that this is COVID-19. My animus for what they did is off the charts.
Well, a biosafety director at the Wuhan lab has been speaking to the state media, calling the U.S. report a complete lie.
I still have yet to see any reliable evidence that these 3 workers existed. The other thing is, David Asher cannot be trusted, according to his own boss's account of the story, and once said that zoonosis occurs when a bat is a pangolin.
I would gladly put $25, $50, $100 million in play for the first Chinese scientists to step forward. But I will tell you this, we don't need Chinese scientists to step forward. The biggest whistles to be blown are going to be people in our own midst who know way too much about what happened in Wuhan because they were involved in what was going on in Wuhan.
In August 2021, the nice piece of the puzzle was leaked to Drastic.
You get these documents, you need to check the story. Who gave us these documents? What is the motivation of that person?
We definitely had concerns, and with Julian Assange and all that, we were basically pretty scared.
And then you have to make some choices. You have to take some risk. And then it's a group decision. And we basically, as a group, decided, look, it's genuine, it's important. We'll publish it.
I think that the most striking piece of evidence for the original COVID-19 to date is the Diffuse proposal. A joint research plan submitted by Peter Daszak of the Equal Health Alliance, Dr. Shijeng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Lin-Fa Wang in Singapore, and Ralph Barrick, University of North Carolina.
Diffuse proposal essentially had Wuhan Institute of Virology and EcoHealth discussing creating novel furin cleavage sites in SARS-like coronaviruses.
Sometimes you have to work with viruses to adapt them to create a vaccine. And sometimes on that route to developing a vaccine, that could be gain of function.
Gain of function research where you manipulate viruses, and in this pandemic, it's led to some conspiracy theories.
Gain of function research is when you cause a bacteria or a human or a mouse or a virus to gain some function that they didn't have before. So if you put GFP, which is a protein that glows green, into a bacteria, and all of a sudden that bacteria glows green, that's a gain of function. Obviously, when people say gain of function research or GOFROC, gain of function research of concern, they are talking about work that is being done with viruses that allow them to gain an increase in transmissibility and or how severely ill it can make you.
Scientists manipulate existing viruses to see how big of a threat they could become. The research also involves finding cures.
Well, essentially what they're doing is they're creating these monsters in these labs and then seeing, well, how do we address this issue? How do we deal with this monster? It's like telling a little boy, like, oh, there's a dangerous snake. Oh, well, go over there and play with the snake so that way you know how to play with a dangerous snake. No, stay away from the snake. Oh, but there's snakes out there and we have to know how to deal with snakes. And the way you deal with snakes is don't go near them.
They somehow think they can control Frankenstein. I understand what a biological threat looks like, okay? From firsthand experience, I do not dismiss the need for biothreat intelligence, but it should involve developing the very pathogens that could be used, even if not intentionally, as a weapon. They would be weaponized the second they got out of any laboratory facility. That research is crazy.
Sometimes these guys like to play God.
There are other people who describe it as looking for a gas leak with a lighted match.
Merry Christmas, terrorists. We talked about this information getting into the wrong hands, perhaps scientists in unfriendly countries, and creating a weapon of mass destruction.
Virologists, especially Ralph Barrick and Dr. Shih-Cheng Li and others, had started to realize that a coronavirus had to be cleaved to make it much better at infecting a human cell. So by 2018, they had co-written and submitted a proposal saying that they wanted to put furin cleavage sites into SARS-like viruses in the lab. The proposal was ultimately not funded. However, the idea had been shared across labs.
This shows the interest, the intent, the desire of these people working on these coronaviruses to actually potentially produce a virus like SARS-CoV-2.
A roadmap to the high-risk research that could have led to the current pandemic, close quote. The project was led by virologist Peter Daszak.
I don't know, if this is smart or not to, study these viruses in these labs. But if you're trying to prevent a pandemic by funding these labs, and the pandemic happens just a few miles away from you, maybe you're failing in your science project. I don't know. One could argue that.
In 2020, both hypotheses were on balance with each other. The thing that shifted the balance for me was the furin cleavage site insertion plan, because this was an additional significant circumstantial piece of evidence that leaned much more in favor of the lab. So a lab says, I'm going to put horns on horses, and a year and a half later, a unicorn is rampaging. What's the likelihood that there are unicorns out in the wild that decided not to go anywhere else but to the exact city where these scientists said we're going to put horns on horses? So for me, once the Diffuse proposal leaked, it really shifted towards the lab.
Yeah, so I was one of the collaborative PI. This kind of idea to put a fusion cleavage site in a coronavirus is a no-brainer. In 2006, people have done this for SARS-1. People thinking by put a fusion cleavage site, the virus will go crazy and become more transmissible. No, it didn't.
The furin site has evolved in a virus along with many other elements. And so to think you could just stick it in and have a desired result is really somewhat laughable. You can't just do that.
No offense, first of all, Alina is not a virologist. Even if somebody wants to insert a fusion cleavage site to make a SARS-CoV-2, if you give me all the top virologists, all the funding from NIH, from EU, from the whole world, in my lifetime, I could not have made this virus. Zero chance. But yes, we want to try, because the vaccine you receive today is genetically engineered, genetically modified, gain of function. Do you want it?
Part of what they proposed at the WIV requires them to have a virus nearly identical to SARS coronavirus 2. There is no evidence that there was that virus at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. To be honest, if there was that evidence, I would probably change my view about the likelihood that it did come from a lab. But if you try to flip this the other way, think about that scenario. You'd have to have somebody at the Wuhan Institute of Virology or some other lab getting infected, going straight to the Wuhan market, which is 10 miles away, without infecting anybody else. At work, at their home, wherever they were living in this huge city of 11 million people, they didn't infect anybody until they got to the Wuhan market for some reason. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? Is it more likely than these wild animals that we always knew were a big pandemic threat spilled over at or before this market pretty much the same way that SARS coronavirus 1 did? To me, I think you have to really continue to twist yourself into a bunch of ever more complex logic pretzels in order to make a lab leak fit the evidence.
Gradually, more and more of the public became aware that there was a real debate, not just scientists versus crackpots. However, NIH and the mainstream media, with the straight face, continued to say natural origin, and like so many things in the United States, this became a partisan issue, which is absolutely bizarre.
From the beginning, the idea that COVID-19 could be related to a lab accident was sort of relegated to the far right. Republicans, and Trump specifically, have used the lab leak theory as a diversion away from the catastrophic way that the Trump administration handled the early phase of the pandemic.
And then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside, or? But it sounds interesting to me.
When you go to a scientific meeting, both sides of the argument are presented. It is a collegial, open discussion. When the news media and politicians sometimes get engaged, that's what fractures trust. It gives people the excuse to say, well, neither knows, because it can't both be right. That is what I saw across the country, that communities didn't feel like they had an anchor. And when you get to that place, then they come to the conclusion that no one knows what they're talking about. And I think it undermines everyone.
There's a subset of America that if Trump says 2 + 2 = 5, they will say yes. And there's another subset of America, equally vociferous, who if Trump says 2 + 2 = 4, they will say no, it equals 5. Stop being a conspiracy theorist.
My own change of view came because evidence started to pile up, mainly through leaks from inside the government and through the hard work of reporters revealing what was really going on in early period when the claim of SARS-CoV-2 was a natural origin.
I reevaluate whether I'm doing the right thing every day, sometimes many times a day. And so far, in my journey up to this point, my desire to get clarity and accountability and justice for the over 1 million American families who have lost a loved one to COVID overrides political implications and this idea that I'm betraying the Democrat team in Washington by reporting on this. I've been working on this for over a year now, hundreds of emails, a lot of phone calls, trying to wrench these documents out of government agencies and universities that would prefer them to be secret. Then one day, it landed. We have thousands of pages of documents, and one of them could hold clues that could help us unravel the story. When you collate all of these sources and put together this timeline, a picture began to emerge and upended what we thought we knew about this story. When the proximal origin paper publishes in March 2020 that says there's no way this could have been a lab origin, the public doesn't know very much about virology. Remember, this is the beginning of the pandemic. So that's why I think the integrity of that paper matters a lot. By putting emails relevant to the drafting of this enormously important article. In order, in context, this picture emerges of virologists who were not upfront about the depth of their concerns about a lab leak. It's really clear that virologists and the leaders of NIH were concerned about biosafety levels at the Wuhan lab. They were calling it a Wild West. One of the scientists even said, "This is bad." They were freaking out. They were exchanging emails about whether or not they had any ties to this lab, and indeed they did. Anthony Fauci had funded EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan lab and was an outspoken supporter of gain-of-function research. So there is a level of panic happening. February 1st, a bunch of virologists get on a phone call and have a discussion. Prominent virologist Christian Anderson presents evidence that the genome looks engineered. And then some virologists pushed back against Anderson's concerns very strongly. Don't even want to nod to the possibility of a lab leak because it's so absurd. Less than a week later, Christian Anderson changed his opinion totally. In private, he was saying, "Good God, this looks artificial," but in public, this emerged from nature. How did that happen?
Several news organizations obtained thousands of pages of Fauci's emails under the Freedom of Information Act from the first months of 2020, thanking Fauci for supporting the theory that COVID naturally developed.
This is just one example of many examples where people said something privately and then publicly said something totally different. And it's always going in one direction, which is to point away from the lab.
There was a conspiracy to label the lab leak theory a conspiracy theory.
Science is essentially like the modern religion. You know, we just think that like, well, if it's science, you know, then it says this. It's not about following the science. There's now ongoing lawsuits to sue the oil and gas industry to find out what they knew about the dangers of climate change. ExxonMobil knew back in the 80s that climate change they predicted like what was going to happen, and their predictions were very accurate. And this is the same thing that we're seeing all over again. All these scientists who are all saying publicly like conspiracy theory to say it came out of a lab in China, internally they're all saying something totally different. When I think that like, you know, Christian Anderson and these scientists were on a phone call with the people who control their careers, what do you think they're gonna do?
We were on the call where the team with Christian Anderson explained, and they explained, so they had been looking at the virus genome, they saw some things, they saw some marks that they didn't quite understand. And they asked us, well, what do you think? And what I found most striking was this discussion of the cleavage site. And I was actually surprised. I was like, well, we see this in flu happening all the time. So don't tell me this does not happen in nature. It does happen in nature. And the example that I mentioned specifically is what we see happening in avian influenza. Every now and then, if this virus makes it into a poultry farm, where there's a lot of opportunity for transmission, then you can get insertion of a cleavage site. It's not about who's right or wrong, it's really you bring out your lines of thinking, bring that together, and you leave it up to them to then take that in their further evaluation process, which is what they did. And that's how science works.
To me, that whole exchange has been really blown out of proportion, because what I see are a group of scientists looking at data, and as they become more familiar with the data, as they continue their analysis, they realize that their initial hypothesis was incorrect.
There is no clear consensus on how the pandemic started. House Republicans launching their own investigation as intelligence officials warn the mystery itself is a threat.
Scientists absolutely should be accountable and transparent when it comes to the substance of their research. Historically, it's never been good when elected officials and congresspeople decide that they're going to start addressing scientific questions, because it essentially says that any scientist who is doing their job is now at risk of being dragged in front of Congress and grilled for political reasons that don't really have anything to do with their actual work and their research.
What do you get when you mix politics and science? You get politics.
There's no reason
I'm not asking you a question right now, Dr. Anderson. Let me just finish my statement, please. We cannot conduct this in this manner, but I will let you speak. Dr. Anderson, is it plausible that such a furin cleavage site could be inserted by a scientist?
If you look at the furin cleavage site that we are specifically finding in SARS-CoV-2 has never been used in experiments prior to this. Further, the furin cleavage site itself is suboptimal and likely out of frame,
So I'm
suggesting
asking,
that this is a clear result of natural selection.
So I'm hearing what you say, Doctor.
However, is it plausible to think that that would alert to this virus? My professional opinion on that is no.
Do you still believe it came from nature?
I do.
On January 15, 2021, the Department of State released a fact sheet entitled Activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Several researchers inside the lab became sick in the fall of 2019. Symptoms like COVID-19.
In the recent report, again, the IC continues to assess that this information neither support nor refutes either hypothesis of the pandemic's origin, because the researchers' symptoms could have been caused by a number of diseases.
Actually, most of the intelligence community believes that the origin of COVID-19 is from the lab.
I think the important thing is that, again, if you look at the intelligence community, for example, the majority of them believe this is natural, right? If you look at
This is just fundamentally not the right way to be investigating this. This is essentially making a bunch of made-up accusations to explain dumb made-up about bioweapons and all this other dumb cobbled together from, I don't know, reading dumb on the internet.
And within 2 days, the conclusion had changed from, oh, this is not going to, oh, it's impossible that this could have happened.
anything is possible. In our own proximal origin paper, for example, we say that we cannot disprove or prove any of the origin hypotheses. If convincing new evidence were to be discovered suggesting otherwise, we would, of course, revise our conclusions. This is science.
So far, the hearings I've seen have not unearthed any new information, so it's troubling to me that they have not systematically and strategically gone after the most likely sources of evidence.
We don't like unanswered questions. And I think what COVID has pointed out, I think, to many of us is there's many unanswered questions. We allowed our own assumptions and perceptions to speak, and that cost American lives.
I can't understand how we can't figure out what the hell happened in Wuhan, China. I think it's the most embarrassing thing ever. I think it's the biggest intelligence failure in the history of the United States. Makes World War II, 9/11 look like nothing.
I think it's quite unfortunate that this debate about the origin of COVID-19 has now fallen to such a level where it just matters who is more confident in asserting their point of view. So it really becomes, it falls down to this network of trust.
I remember being younger, and if somebody was a doctor, you know, they automatically commanded respect. They were automatically viewed as somebody who knew about things that the average person didn't know and who could be trusted with them. And now I don't think that's the case. You know, personally, I am attacked. I've gotten death threats. I've gotten threats. Some of my colleagues have it even worse, though. My bigger concern is not just for the personal toll on me or any of my friends and colleagues. It's the toll that it might take on our profession.
We need you more than ever on our side. I can see you over there.
I'm very discouraged with many things besides science that have to do with disinformation and the truth throughout the world. And like, I'm getting kind of emotional talking about this, but I feel like in some ways it's a very depressing time to be alive.
They passed all the same laws that are being passed.
It often comes back to reckless, evil virologists are playing God with these dangerous viruses for no real good reason, and that's putting the entire world at risk, whereas it couldn't be further from the truth in my experience.
Turnkey totalitarianism. They are putting in place all of these technological mechanisms for control.
Many people say that scientists are being paid by Big Pharma to say things. I wish I were, but I'm not, and most scientists I know are not paid by Big Pharma to say anything. Many scientists I know don't speak with anyone. They don't grant interviews. They get discouraged by seeing how their field gets warped.
As I said, it is beautiful.
Critical thinking is hard, and we don't teach everyone how to do that. Just people being against vaccines is astonishing to many people, and it almost challenges their belief in science, because they say, this is science, why don't they believe in it?
Without virology, we will not be able to make more vaccines. We will not be able to make more life-saving drugs. We will not be able to even understand all the many different unknown pathogens that will continue to threaten our species. Virology is essential to continued human civilization and existence.
There's certainly this sentiment that we may not need to know the origin of COVID-19 to move on. There are people who I think are overly optimistic that even without knowing the origin, we can address both risk. But as we've seen, neither risk have really been addressed. The wildlife trade is still roaring. Like, China has done basically nothing. And then you have a growing number of labs working with dangerous pathogens, and there's no oversight over this happening in so many countries around the world.
But there's no learning on this. They want to keep funding. They want to have labs. They don't think about the social implications of what they're doing. And these scientists want to do these crazy experiments, and then they don't want to let you know that that's what they're doing. They lie that that's what they're doing, because in their heads, it's just science.
The lab leak theory is an incredibly destructive distraction because it risks putting all of our resources towards a risk that is minuscule compared to the actual risk, which is potentially catastrophic. Viruses that are evolving and potentially emerging in wild animals all around the world. The way that we use land, the mobility of the human species, climate change, disruption of ecosystems. We don't live in a bubble or a vacuum. We do live as part of this large, complex ecosystem that is the world.
The origins controversy has dragged on for 4 years, but we do know that a pandemic will happen again, whether it comes from nature or from a lab. By attempting to save us, these scientists are creating technologies that if that virus were to leak or to be used for malicious intent, it could cause millions of deaths.
Year after year, experts have measured humanity's proximity to midnight. In other words, to self-destruction. The so-called doomsday clock. In 2023, they surveyed the state of the world and they came to a clear conclusion. The doomsday clock is now 90 seconds to midnight, the closest the clock has ever stood to humanity's darkest hour. In truth, the doomsday clock is a global alarm clock. We need to wake up and get to work.